This is the Hour of History podcast. Our world, anytime, anyplace. And now from the Hour of History studio in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, your Hour of History starts right now.
Hello and welcome to Hour of History. This week on the Hour of History podcast, we have Travis Roy with us in the Hour of History studios. Aren't they beautiful, Mathias?
Yeah, I mean, it's we've got a flag now. We're very official. We are consuming some delicious, is it Genesee? Cream
Jenny.
Ale.
I believe it's called Jenny.
It's called Jenny Cream Ale. We're ready to rock and roll. I'm Mathias Fueling, if you haven't recognized my voice by now, because you've been listening avidly to every single minute of every episode we've ever done.
Hopefully, yeah, because we're putting out an episode every week, and we now have listeners from every continent except Antarctica. We're still waiting.
We're working on that. We're working on that.
And if you know people in Mexico, they could really step up their game. I don't know if this is because of all the wall talk.
We should talk about AMLO. That'll get some
yeah, no, maybe we will. But anyway, so we're always open to suggestions. Thank you for tuning in. And without any further ado, Travis, who are you, and why would you be on a history podcast?
That's a good question. So I'm a Temple PhD candidate. I do 19th century American environmental history. I look primarily at like human-animal relationships, particularly when it comes to how governments and organizations work to deliberately drive certain species to extinction while saving other animals that they deem to be of higher quality.
Okay, so do you have like specific animals? Because I'm definitely thinking in terms of like the turn of like the perception in the late 19th century of like approaching the buffalo or approaching certain other species where initially it's like, oh my God, we're the white men conquering the plains. Right. And then it very rapidly becomes like, oh, wait a second, we want to preserve these species. But then, like, wolves, of course, takes a lot longer for that process to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say you're kind of talking about, like, the halcyon days of conservation, like the glory days.
When Teddy Roosevelt is literally just like, make that whole state a park.
Right. So, yeah, that's where I kind of focus most of my energy is the early 1900s.
Oh, okay.
But that's kind of where it terminates, because I also look a lot at Darwin, pre-Darwin attitudes towards extinction, this kind of belief that extinction couldn't happen, and it becomes this belief that extinction must be a providential good, like God must allow this. This is what's supposed to be.
So where do you start with this? Are you like looking at like what? How does this even happen? Like because a lot of people, when you study history, I get a lot of comments like, "Are you Jewish? Are you Cuban?" And I say, "No, I'm not Cuban." And I have to give a long explanation on why I'm studying a different religion in a different region of the world than where I'm from. So like, you're not from the 19th century, and
I'm just the oldest of the people.
And you're not an animal. I mean, yes, like a technical sense, but
yeah. So where does this come from?
Where does this come from? So I, at the risk of giving like my whole life story, I really kind of petered around after high school and like went to film school, played in bands, like did a lot of like finding myself type stuff. And during that time, I got really into just reading nonfiction in general. And so that's where my love of history came in. But so as I started reading history a lot, like in my early 20s, because I didn't really read it before that, I was reading a lot of evolutionary biology. I got really into like Richard Dawkins and that kind of stuff. Who's said some problematic things lately, but
wait, the Blind Watchmaker is a great book.
Yeah, The Ancestor's Tale is a hugely influential.
Early Richard Dawkins is respectable.
Yeah.
And then around 2000, he lost his mind.
But regardless of like him, just evolutionary biology and in general, something I got really into, zoology and all that kind of stuff. But I am not very scientifically minded. I'm way more social sciencey, so I kind of try to figure out a way like how can I like bridge my interest between these two things, history and animals, and in a way that I'm good at.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think a lot of like you see in this beautiful studio, my spirit animal, the manatee, comes into my mind, but I would never think like, how could I? And I'm sure I could make that into like a really interesting history of like Florida law, boat law.
Oh my god! And you can go way back into like the whole myth with them as mer people and that kind of stuff.
They are sexy.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen some fine manatee, but by all means, put this out in public.
So so it ends up being but is that like the lowest common denominator? Like as historians, we always end up getting back to like, well, what did they end up legislating about it? Like, do you work with Native Americans and stuff?
So I do some. I mean, it's particularly because so much of what, especially if you're looking at that TR kind of era, if you're looking at the West, you can't not regard what American Indians were doing at that time. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I definitely do some, but it's also kind of felt like, my advisor is Andrew Eisenberg, and that's something he's dealt with heavily. I've worked closely with Steve Hossman. That's something he deals with a lot. And it's kind of started to feel like someone else's thing. So I kind of became more like the animal guy. I'm always more focused on the animals themselves and the people, which is not a great way to do history, but you can learn a lot about people based on how they treat.
Can you give me an animal? Not a manatee, like a West 19th century animal.
So I do a lot with prairie dogs. I look at prairie dogs a lot.
Yeah, we need to start at the basics there because I think I know what a prairie dog is.
Yeah, you probably do.
Lion King.
No,
that's a meerkat.
It's a meerkat. It's a meerkat, but it would fill the same ecological niche in Africa.
Oh, okay.
So you're on the right track, I guess. Is where I'm
so it's a little animal that pops up.
Yeah, they're very social animals. They're very vocal animals. There is this. One of the most fascinating things about prairie dogs is that you can look into this. There's a researcher named Slobodovich, which I'm not even going to try and spell, but you can kind of try it if you want. He's written multiple books on prairie dog language and the prairie dogs can get so specific in their language that they can, with their different chirps and different pitches and stuff, they can determine like, here comes the fat man in the yellow shirt through town. Or here comes a hawk. Here comes the fast.
So they
fox.
they have a language.
They straight up have a language in the same way that we do or crows do. They're able to that's one of the few animal species that we've made a lot of headway in determining like what their actual language is. So I'm interested in them for that reason, and I'm also interested in them because like they represent. They perfectly represent like the misunderstanding that takes place when capitalism meets up with animals, especially in the West. Like there's this belief that prairie dogs, that their presence is going to be detrimental to the ranch, right?
They're pests.
Right, they're pests. They're going to dig holes. The cattle or the horse is gonna their foot's going to go in the hole. It's going to break, that kind of stuff. And they're going to keep good ground. They're going to keep the ground sterile or something like that. There's this belief that's not good for the ground.
It's kind of like spiders, how we needlessly make them out to be the bad guy.
Well, yeah, prairie dogs actually, their presence is it's a ecological good because they bring like fallow land back. They only go to areas and they only eat like forbs and stuff that cattle don't eat anyways. So cattle and horses are going to be unlikely to be around those kind of areas. So they do an actual good for the area, but the problem is that you have like all these ranchers associations and cattlemen's associations historically that believe the opposite, and of course they're ranching on public lands, but they're able to successfully get the government to believe that like, oh, this is hurting the bottom line.
Wasn't it Tocqueville that said it was voluntary organizations that change America? That's what makes America different, is like these voluntary ranchers associations. Like
I guess so. So would you say that's
like,
what I
look at a lot.
Would you say that like part of kind of, because I grew up out west, like I'm from like Idaho / Utah / Arizona / New Mexico.
Prairie dog country.
And still to this day, right, people they call them rock chucks sometimes.
Rock chuck.
There's so many kinds of ground squirrel.
Yeah, and I think there's a type of ground squirrel where people will just be like, yeah, man, we're going to go shoot some rock chucks. And
they just shoot them.
Oh, yeah, it's a huge deal. Like, that's just what, like,
Just because
it's just they're just seen as just like rodent, like pests, like vermin. Like it's just like yeah, dude, go get your 22 and some beers and drive out in like middle of nowhere and shoot up some rock chucks.
And that kind of gets at why I got into Prairie Dogs too. Is that this I didn't start with Prairie Dogs. I actually started with rats, and I started in the East, and I was
New York City.
No, I did. I started looking at New York City, and I was looking at Philly. And in the 19th century, because I was looking at extermination methods and how they coincided with the birth of the animal rights movement, and again with like private organizations and all this kind of stuff, and like at the same time you had it was just this weird time where like squirrels are being introduced into parks and like being like, hey, let's make squirrels like a city animal now, and all this people are concerned about horses and that are in the city, right?
Yeah.
All that kind of stuff. But it was definitely like a time where it's just like we're gonna really differentiate between species. I mean, understandably, rat is vermin, but prairie dog aren't vermin. But being a rodent, kind of they earned that.
I mean, do you think some of that's kind of the manifest destiny ideology and a kind of like preconceived notion of what like the American West should be like that contributes to this? Right, as sort of settlers move in, they're bringing in maybe like more European or more East Coast notions of what like ideal nature is supposed to be, and then they just try and map it over into a new environment. And when that doesn't obviously isn't 1-to-1, they're just like, well, we just got to kill these animals, right? Because they're like they're not supposed to be here.
Animal genocide, which is just a genocide, right? But
sure, I would say that setting aside like the problematic term manifest destiny, because that's just it's a whole other thing, but we'll just set that aside. I would say it definitely predates that kind of conceptualization, because if you look at say the work of Alan Taylor or John Coleman, who they do a really good job looking at more early frontier days in New England and that kind of stuff, you can see a steady purge of wildlife. There's always been like this belief that the New World is a place that must be tamed, right? And part of that taming meant like the clearing of forestry, the clearing of human inhabitants, and the replacement of indigenous species with beneficial species like cows and pigs.
And see, that's where I was kind of interested with like the Native Americans, because they're kind of viewing the world in a much different way, right? Did they have an understanding that prairie dogs are like not bad? Or is that the like sort of like noble savage type thing?
I mean, I think that people are quick to fall into that when it comes to American Indians. Like, like indigenous people played a pretty hefty. I mean, I don't know if I want to say that exactly.
Well, they were definitely doing land like manipulation and land cultivation,
and plenty of hunting. I mean, especially in the 19th century.
Yeah, it's not like they weren't having just a neutral effect. Like, they were very active in the
environment. Were they like taking beers out and shooting it with a 20?
Well, I mean, so as French and English and Spanish kind of started infiltrating the New World, what they largely did was drive the indigenous peoples before them to get the animals, to do the trapping for them. So like there was because so much of the push for the New World was based on England trying to get some sort of gold, some sort of resource, right? I mean, like part of it was like, okay, we got trees now, but like what else? What fur. So indigenous peoples were often coerced or tempted into like a barter system for kettles and rifles.
And the French are doing this too, right?
The French are doing it, the English are doing it.
And the prairie dog, like squirrel, that's like, the prairie dog is a North American animal with relatives that are similar elsewhere.
Yeah, with like divergent evolution has like similar
But there's
animals.
not like a European prairie dog. There's not prairie in Europe.
Well, no, there's like woodchucks and that kind of stuff. I mean, I don't know what they call them. They're gopher type creatures. I mean, it's kind of like in America. I mean, like I grew up in Michigan. We had gophers and woodchucks.
Right.
It's the same.
Down in Louisiana, they have nutrias. Those are actually introduced. Yeah.
Yeah, those are.
So I'm curious about this, especially with the voluntary associations, because in my small world, besides manatees, I also love birds. And at this time, birds were like really cool to have in your hats. And a lot of the voluntary organizations like started saying, well, maybe that's not so cool. Yeah. But birds are nice looking and they make good sounds. Like, who's going to be like prairie dogs? All right.
Like birds, that had a lot to do with some of the earliest protection of endangered species, which, for however long that kind of stuff will last. But
and no one's already the Migratory Bird Act, right?
That's exactly. The Migratory Bird Act was the second or third, I think, American law that was passed, or bill that was passed to protect species. That was the idea. Like too many birds were being stripped of their plumage for women's hats.
Yeah.
So so early on, you can kind of see with the protection of horses, with the protection of birds. It was generally concert with bison because of this idea of a frontier manliness needed to be preserved. Most animal preservation hinged on some sort of belief that this creature served a public good or a consumption good, somehow beneficial. Prairie dogs, which Lewis and Clark were the first white people to see and record during their whole exhibition. That was the kind of thing they saw them and went whoa, there's a ton of them. Roughly 90% has been decimated since.
Whoa.
Yeah, since not since their time specifically, but since America, or since the since the invasion of the New World. So the species has precipitously dropped. Can
I interrupt and
can we
talk about Lewis and Clark for a second? And you could probably construct the world better than I think most people understand. So after the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis and Clark are sent on an expedition west. I think this is the basic one line you're taught in high school.
It's even weirder than that in a way, because yes, that's all true. But what's really weird is that Thomas Jefferson had a mastodon skull that he was gifted from.
Mathias knew this.
I knew this. Yeah, because all the founding fathers were crazy.
But
weirdo.
You knew about the mastodon.
Yeah, they were all crazy weirdo natural. They called themselves natural philosophers. Because the hard science humanity split hadn't happened, and that's not going to happen for another 100+ years. And so for them, they're just I'm just an empirically minded dude who wants to learn about the world. So they're
a man of letters.
Yeah, so they're just collecting all kinds of crazy stuff from all over the world, and maybe and isn't the idea that there's maybe the mastodon live out west? Thomas Jefferson was exactly maybe in the plains there's still a living mastodon.
It wasn't even maybe. It was more there must be.
Yeah,
so I believe it was Charles Wilson Peale that dug it up for him.
Who's that?
Charles Wilson Peale was he was a painter from the Revolutionary era.
Oh, okay.
And so I think, correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it kind of they were getting reports of bison and they were kind of confusing that, or getting reports that there's big animals out west?
There definitely was this belief that there was big animals out west, but I don't know for sure if they actually had any supposed spottings of mastodon. But you can go to Monticello and the actual mastodon skull is still there.
How cool!
But yeah, so he gets this mastodon skull, and like everyone else, other natural philosophers at that time, the belief was extinction isn't a thing. The dodo had already happened, but it was such a rarity, and it was the whole they were so stupid they deserved it. It was earned. That whole narrative had already been constructed. So generally, the idea was, other than the dodo, this is an impossibility.
But isn't that sorry to interrupt? Isn't that my understanding too? That's part of kind of the natural law, kind of philosophy that's also kind of coming through in the Constitution, right? Is God has created the world, or some mighty power has created the world in a very perfect, orderly manner, and given each creature in the world certain duties and obligations, and ergo human beings have certain rights from that. But part of that is that every creature has its place, and so it wouldn't make sense for something to just die, because it would be but God created it to exist.
Right.
It has to be there for the order of the universe to work. So extinction just doesn't logically fit in that kind of framework.
Yeah, if you're working with the belief that Noah put certain species on the ark, and those species were the only ones to propagate,
and God wants the world a certain way,
right? And again, and a lot people are at this point, Charles Lyell had kind of started doing some geology at that point, so we're getting kind of a sense of how old the world was, but it wasn't naturally accepted.
And dinosaur fossils haven't really been excavated.
That was my next point. So this kind of stuff is just kind of starting to percolate. People are just starting to think about dinosaurs and about the Earth being older than 6,000 years, all this kind of stuff. So then it's so Lewis and Clark are sent out west not just to hunt mastodon, but in part, like it's like, map the West, figure out what's going on out there, what kind of species of animals are out there, and by the way, if you can get me a living specimen of a mastodon,
that'd be
or
cool.
A stuffed one or something, then that would be great.
And no one, they don't really know what's out there, and there's people living out there in certain areas.
Absolutely, yeah.
But most of the land is just what? There's a lot of United States land. When you fly over, it's just you see cities every couple hours. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, the U.S. is big.
The U.S. is huge, so I'm trying to picture what are these guys seeing? It's just animals and wilderness.
They were describing things like bison, like seas of bison, because this was prior to much of the decline. Some of the decline had started at that point, but the major decline was more in the 18th or the 19th century, rather. So they're talking about seas of bison. And they're talking about other animals that they find of interest, but they are kind of mostly focused on big fauna. There's this thing going on where I don't want to say who it was. I want to say the Comte de Buffon in France. I can't remember who it was, but someone who I want to say that was who it was had written this book where it was the new world, animals are degenerative there. Human people that go there are going to become smaller. The animals are smaller. Everyone's just weaker there. So Thomas Jefferson, part of the reason he wrote Notes on the State of Virginia was in response to this, and that was part of what him sending Lewis and Clark out for was no, I want to prove we're a big masculine country, and I want to show you just how big our animal species are. Get a big elk or something.
Yeah. And so none of them are reading the Spanish who are out in the West. Did the Spanish have expeditions that went east? Or is there nothing?
I know that there was a Spanish expedition that made it into southern Texas,
right?
That actually made it into the plains, early, in the 1500s, 1600s.
They must have gone pretty far.
Yeah, but distribution of information is not as
I guess the Spanish they were communicating a lot with the French, huh?
Yeah. Right. They all probably spoke 5 or 6 languages, but they probably just wouldn't be troubled to read a lot of that stuff. I'm not sure what level of interest Spanish people at that time may have had in natural philosophy.
Is this pre-Humboldt even?
Humboldt would have been around the same time. Humboldt was around 1700. So
and he's pretty read by everyone, right? The Spanish, because he travels through Spanish.
I don't want to say the same time. It's more 100 years before.
Oh yeah, he's way before.
Yeah, he would have informed a lot of the viewpoints of Jefferson.
And then they go out there and they're like, wait a minute, there are no mastodon. But there's all this other crazy stuff.
These weird little barking squirrel type things, and they have these little villages.
And that's quite a distance to go though, when you're coming upon sea of bison and just tons of nature from that point to getting to a point in a century later where people have to form organizations to protect the animals. That's really fast that's happening.
Yeah. If you ever not to just repeatedly plug my advisor, but if you ever read Eisenberg's
book on bison?
But I was going to say the Mining California book.
Oh no, I haven't.
It's a good exploration, and Richard White has done a lot of this kind of stuff too. But if you want a good exploration of the rampant industrialization and the impact that they had in the American environment, that'd be a good place to start. In the 19th century, because it was just a period of just it's just absolute there's it was just a free-for-all.
Just total decimation. So then, who is it? Is it people like Theodore Roosevelt who sort of kick off these? I'm interested in the voluntary organization angle.
Yeah.
How does that start? Where's the news getting back? Is it stories, skeletons, letters?
It's images in part. It's hunters largely. So the conservation movement was really mostly pushed by hunters. Who had kind of started to see a drop in the game, and they were concerned about that. We want to kill these giant things, and there's less of these giant things we want to kill. So
it's becoming harder.
We got to save these giant things so I can kill them, and that's weirdly a commonplace.
Well, that's still now. That's still especially because when was it? Cecil the tiger or Cecil the lion was shot, and that's what you hear a lot of these these kind of polemical takes is well, that's a good thing. Hunters are good because they at least provide a justification and also like a market that is invested in preserving big game animals. So like them killing this elephant or this lion, yeah, that's crappy, but it's good in the long run because it helps preserve the species.
Yeah, it's totally counterintuitive. This whole idea that like, it's good for the tourism and like it's going to create more money for the area, which means more protection. It's like, and I come from the position of like, just don't shoot animals, don't shoot endangered animals. It's one thing if you're talking about.
Now, is this a modern position, or do you come across this in the 19th century?
You come across this now and then.
So was it? I mean, my first guess is Quakers probably don't like shooting animals.
It has nothing to do with Quakers.
No, that you haven't come across any Quakers.
I don't want to say nothing. I mean, like there was definitely some like early vegetarian Quakers and that kind of stuff, like really early. But the organized movement. You can really look. It got its footing first, I would say, with the Royal Society of Prevention of the Cruelty of Animals in England, and then a mirror image version of that is picked up, and I want to say Boston by George Angle first.
So say that again. The Royal Society
for the Prevention of Cruelty of Animals versus the American, ASPCA.
Yeah, it sounds like a very modern thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's 1904.
And would you say though, this seems like it always seems like kind of like
maybe earlier.
Well, like it seems like kind of like the natural park movement and the kind of like animal protection movement and things like that. It always seems to be much more of an American phenomenon because at least in like Europe or in other parts of the world, right, have just been so intensely inhabited by humans for thousands of years that like that the Rubicon of like that's true. But it seems like the Rubicon of like human impact on the environment has just gone so far that like all of those species got wiped out way before, so there's really nothing left to preserve. Like the habitats in those areas have already been so transformed.
Well, so I mean, like if you look at say wolves in England and UK in general, they're extirpated entirely. They're driven out.
Like by like the Middle Ages.
Yeah, exactly. But animal rights as an organized kind of thing, it starts as like an upper middle class response to seeing animals in the city, usually horses.
Oh, because they would just kill them in the city, right?
Yeah, like so horses would be like both in England and in America. Horses were usually used to to lead omnibuses and that kind of stuff, and the draymen or the people that drove them were known to be pretty cruel to them, but also
I've read Black Beauty.
Yeah, they're still in Central Park.
But at the same time, these guys were driven. These guys were poor men, and they were driven to like try and get as much profit as they could. But again, like the capitalism is always the enemy.
So this is actually kind of like a response to the industrial process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay. It's so like as with increased industrialization becomes like increased luxury and increased time, and with that increased time, it's like, hey. Suddenly I have like this time to kill and I have all this money, maybe I'm upper middle class. I don't like watching animals and dogs and cats be murdered for sport in the streets. And a lot of it was also tied up with orphans at the same time too, like early versions of this kind of stuff. Like they kind of lumped orphans in with it because there really wasn't any concern for them.
They started living in the city with these...
Is that also... Because is that kind of like a eugenics-y kind of thing where it's sort of like not just in terms of like worried about animals, but like we're worried about the lower classes of humans because they're sort of because the upper class are conflating them with animals.
Yeah, you hit a major thread there, like a major theme. So like, I mean, not with the implementation of these organizations by any means. Like it wasn't like trying to control class or people or anything like that. But part of what my work looks at is like looking at TR, for instance, because he was a bit of a fan of eugenics.
Yeah, a bit.
Yeah, well,
tell that to Korea.
A wee bit, to put it lightly. And a lot of people in his circle, his social circle, were conservationists that were also eugenicists, and this whole belief that like nature is a thing to be tampered with, tinkered with, improved upon, and that means some species got to go, some species must be saved. And when they're talking about species, this is like the era of like Hottentots and quadroons, and this belief that like there are certain the pseudoscience of like all this kind of so like. They genuinely believed that like different races of people were different species, so then it kind of led into this eugenics kind of
because isn't it? My understanding is like what was the guy like one of the founders of Oh, like something...
Madison Grant?
Madison Grant, yeah. So tell me a little about Madison Grant. Because
you gave him nothing and he pulled that.
Because Madison Grant is a crazy, crazy figure. So can you tell us a little bit about Madison Grant, Travis?
I mean, like, he's crazy by our standards.
But at the time, he's
very respectable.
Very respected.
He has best friends.
Yeah, so he's a founder of what society? I know it's some big...
God, what did he founded, I want to say, the Sierra Club?
Yeah, that's it. He was one of the founders of the Sierra
Club.
But he also wrote this book called The Passing of a Great Race.
Of the Great Race.
Which Adolf Hitler famously declared later was his Bible. Because Madison Grant was sort of one of these pioneers in basically Nordic Aryan race theory, that there was one specific type of humans that...
And he was a hardcore conservationist.
Yeah, that originated in Northern Europe, and everything great and awesome in human civilization was directly because of these people, and everyone else was degenerate barbarians. And the problem of the modern world is that these noble Aryans from Northern Europe were getting, taken over by the lower class, the lower races. And then Hitler read that as a younger dude. We're not quite sure when. Maybe when he was homeless in Vienna or at some point, and was this is it.
It was that. It was that era is what's it called, the Camp of the Saints. You know what I'm talking about? It was that era is that kind of thing.
Yeah. So he's this is my shit.
Yeah. And he was this premier conservationist, respected lawyer, one of Teddy Roosevelt's closest friends. He did a lot of good in the conservation movement, and he helped kick off the eugenics movement, which, of course, we know where that led.
Yeah, and then also Teddy Roosevelt wrote this trilogy, The Winning of the West, which is also super racist, because it's also this kind of Aryan race theory of the noble white man conquering, the savage land, and sort of we did it. We white people won the West kind of thing, ideology.
Yeah,
this unabashed, unquestioned.
It's a weird thing too, because I know and it's weird. It's awkward, right, to look at the history of the early ecological kind of environmental movement and be oh, there's some really nasty things going on here.
Oh yeah.
But that's based on their vision of human nature and differentiations among humans.
Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have people say C. Hart Merriam. C. Hart Merriam, he headed the Bureau of Biological Survey, which was this was one of the first organizations within the government that terminated animals on mass amounts, poison, leaving strychnine around the country, that kind of stuff. And he was a friend of these guys. He was an associate of Madison Grant's, and he was a really good friend of Teddy Roosevelt. He was a frequent visitor at the White House and that kind of stuff. And he, as far as I know, he wasn't a eugenicist, but he still took his interest from animals into ethnography, and got really into indigenous peoples, and he ended up retiring and moving to Lagunitas, California, and it just becoming an anthropologist at the end of his life. And so it still kind of represents this whole weird viewpoint where white naturalists were looking at native peoples or non-white peoples, I guess, as other species, but their reactions would be anything from well, let's terminate them for the greater good of the white man, or as Madison Grant would have, or Merriam's response, which was we need to preserve their culture,
or which is my understanding too, that's where the reservation idea comes in, is the idea that
this would have been after that.
After this is when kind of to put it kind of nastily, the West has been truly won. Then the government's well, what do we do with remaining Native Americans? And the idea is, well, we can either forcibly assimilate them into supposedly superior European American culture, or we can give them certain tracts of land that will be sort of their land to preserve and do their own thing on.
Yeah, I mean that kind of predated a lot of this kind of stuff, or coincided with some of it too. But yeah, I mean I think a lot of evil has been done in world history under the pretense of doing good, right? And that's probably one of those things.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is straight out of the Enlightenment, just categorizing the world, quantifying things, putting things in places. And I'm curious how it's different for empire versus, would you just call the United States basically another empire that's sort of colonizing the West? Because everything you've said tends to mirror what I've read on, say, the British Empire and race. I don't know what the British were doing with animals, but I would imagine it's the same. Going to India, recategorizing these animals as sort of ancient species or modern or
Well, I know with that I know. I wrote a paper on Francis Bacon, not the old English kind of like Renaissance man.
Frank Bacon.
But well, because he was the great explorer, Francis Bacon. The great 19th century. Or am I totally?
I think Francis Drake. Is your Francis Drake?
No.
That's not 19th century.
Yeah.
Why am I missing up? Sorry, I'm missing up the name. He was like one of the great British explorers in Africa.
Oh
God! Why?
Well, anyway, just tell us about him.
No. I'm gonna find this.
Well, but
everybody's gonna wait.
And that's one thing I wanted to compare the U.S.
Continue for a second.
U.S. going west on this sort of like. It seems is very akin to the British imperial projects in Africa, and
I like the way that you phrase that, and I think it's really accurate.
Yeah,
I never, to be honest, I can't say I ever really thought of it that way, because part of me, and and it's weird to admit this on a podcast after like a decade of doing history, but part of me is still sloughing off like the indoctrination of my youth, in terms of history, because like. I don't think Americans like to think of the West as being colonized, right? I mean, we tend to think of it more of like the manifest destiny. Something was supposed to happen, right?
Yeah.
We had these preordained borders that we were supposed to fill, and things just went the way they were supposed to go, right? So like, and the reason I think that Americans often don't look at it that way is because they don't recognize that these indigenous people were nations, right? These were nations with fixed borders a lot of the times, and, and so to call it colonization is pretty accurate, especially if you think of it in colonization the way of like eradicating people.
Yeah, and then the other thing is like, at what point, where do we put the animals? At what point, like, are they colonizing the animals as well? Like, because it's unfair. I mean, the word genocide doesn't come around until after World War II. This is a UN term, and we agree what genocide is after what they had seen at the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. So you're like sort of after the fact applying it in cases. You can't really call something that happens before the 1940s.
I don't think it's anachronistic to apply it.
Well, I think let's for a second say you can.
Okay.
Are animals enough to say that it was American genocide being carried out on animals as well as...
Well, I feel like no, because then we're sort of equating animals with humans, which I think most people would morally want to say that there is a difference, even though I think most people morally would say like animal cruelty and torturing animals and stuff like that is wrong. Mm-hmm. That there is a distinction between killing an animal and killing a human being. A very like and even in huge quantities. I feel like most people would be a little weirded out if you said there was a genocide of the bison as opposed to like a genocide of a group of people, just because we don't morally put animals and humans on the same level.
But those things were linked, though. Like, I mean, part of the reason extinction was to mess with tribes,
and also to forcibly like remove food supply.
And are the people who are fighting for the animals' rights? How do they talk about animals? Do they talk about them as like slightly less than human but important, or like why do they care?
They care like it's usually like it degrades the man to beat the beast, right? Like that's partly where they're coming from. There's
still slavery,
right? This is happening.
Yeah.
Well, no, I mean, like not in America.
Not totally. Yeah.
But like there's Jim Crow slavery at this point, right? Absolutely. But yeah, there's definitely this. Well, I've kind of lost my thread.
This sense of like why that there is something that's sentient about animals that we need to protect.
Yeah, that's not really there. Not generally there. I mean, there's still like this Descartes kind of attitude that like animals are like not mechanisms that don't feel pain. They may squawk, but that's just like a machine. I'm not saying they all necessarily felt that way, but they're not quite getting to the point where they're like concerned about the livelihoods.
But it's probably more like they want to preserve a certain kind of order in the natural world.
With
right now, it's not necessarily about animal rights, but about preserving a kind of hierarchy of the world.
Well, that and as I just said to Stephen, it's like this preservation of like gentility, right? Like it's not. It's not a classy thing to beat your horse. It's not a classy thing to beat your dog. And these are mostly, these are like socialites, right? These are rich society types that
have time to worry about.
That have time to worry about this kind of stuff, and are going down into the dirtier parts of the city and talking to draymen and being like, you should not do that. You should give your horse plenty of water, that kind of stuff. And they're like, okay.
Well, I mean, you still encounter that a little bit in America to this day about it definitely the treatment of animals is definitely thought of as a class issue for sure.
Well,
sure.
Yeah, and can we link that to vegetarianism? Like when Gandhi goes to India, I have to bring Gandhi into every episode. When he goes to India, that's where he finds his community because he's a vegetarian. The Indians are vegetarians, like almost
Hindus.
Yeah, almost entirely, and. So that was one of the promises he made to his mom is he wasn't going to have sex and he wasn't going to eat meat. And so he goes to India and he meets guess Gandhi's not having fun. But so he goes to England and he meets all these socialites. These
people follow him. They like
his first published letters are in the Journal of Vegetarianism. And for him, it's this cultural, religious thing. But for them, it's sort of like this consciousness awakening, and they're tying it into like sentience of animals. And
I think a phrase we haven't thrown out yet that we should in talking about this era is like the progressive era, right? Like this is the progressive era. Not progressivism as we think about it now with like a liberal kind of whatever, but more like this attitude that all of society is just a step away from being perfect with the right incremental turns of the screw. We can get everything just exactly perfect, and that means
in tune,
right? And that means all means all. And there was some good that came from this era.
Some
there was some
eugenics.
Or
it means preservation of natural resources.
So do we have a like estimate of how many is vegetarianism a thing?
I believe. I mean, it's been a thing for a very long time.
Frontier, though, do you ever come across like
one of them rare vegan cowboys?
Like, I'm just gonna eat this wheat. Or
I can't say I've come across any of that whatsoever.
Interesting.
And again, like most of the conservation, overwhelmingly, the conservation taking place in the West was done by actors from the East.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, because that's something even today you find elements of in terms.
What is it?
Well, ranchers. I mean, infamously with the Bundy case recently, and then of course Trump pardoning two of the ranchers that helped set off that whole firestorm of nastiness, right? But like this idea of like we ranchers have been out here and we know what we're doing, and we don't need some government or somebody from the big city or from out east telling us how to run our land or something like that. Even though like it's legally not their land, they're just renting it.
Which is the saddest irony.
But the thing is though that they've been but that's also because like I could go on to this because I worked for the Forest Service for a while and my dad did too, so like kind of like American land policy is on my mind a lot. But like it's just weird, like American land policy's got a lot of problems too because many ranchers in the U.S. don't own their own land. They rent it, but they can rent it. But the way the policy works is it's never been updated since like the 19th century because of rancher lobbying.
Right. Where
literally a rancher and his family can rent like acres for like pennies, literal pennies. And there's really no mechanism of collecting it. Like it took Bundy like decades before the U.S. government was like, you need to start paying your rent on this land. And then there's also like there's no like term limit per se. There's no like end of your lease. Like as long as you keep renewing it, and as long as you keep up to date on your payments, a ranchering family can rent public land for like generations. Well, and that's definitely something that's happened. And so it's at this point you've had like some ranching families that like basically think of the land as theirs because they've been there for like 70 years.
Right. They have generations of wealth generated by the use of public lands and operating under the assumption or the illusion that, say, prairie dogs, for instance, are detrimental to that land. As opposed to saying that narrow interest group, even if they're right, which they're not, but so that narrow interest group determines how this land is used and how the fate of these animals that live there, as opposed to like looking at like all those people who aren't ranchers, and we could say, well, don't all these Americans stand to benefit from the existence of these creatures, like from the preservation of this land? But like it gets boiled down to these cattlemen associations and ranchmen associations.
So how did the lobbying Mathias did a good job of like telling us what the situation was like that just happened in the last decades. How was the lobbying happening when you were first going out west? Because it took so long to get back east. Like, how are they?
Well, there wasn't lobbying per se, right?
So how did they influence? Because the laws were still being made, or were they just much more local?
Well, that was part. I mean, like I was saying, the 19th century was just free for all, and that was partly why. Like, I mean, it wasn't until, God bless him, Richard Nixon, that we could really start putting a lot of regulations on the industry and that kind of stuff. That was sarcasm.
So America was free.
Back when America was great.
That's what it means. Oh my god.
Yeah, but I mean, it was reckless. That's why these conservation efforts were being done by independent entities, because the government itself was doing precious little to conserve anything.
Is this an argument against like a libertarianism of the environment?
It certainly can be.
So is that an unfair, like, sort of presentist comparison to say that it was kind of like a libertarian paradise going out west? There was like no rules, and business was running the show. Like, if you needed this land, you could take it.
I can say that if you are opposed to regulation of industry, you should look at the 19th century and the environment.
Well, it was called the Wild West for a reason, right? It was notorious. It's famous for being a violent era.
I thought it was because Will Smith was fighting like these.
Oh yeah,
he was fighting Kevin Kline. He was a spider.
Excuse me, that's the Wild Wild West. Oh, I'm not gonna. I'm talking about the Wild West.
Steampunk is very interesting.
Yeah, but I think. Yeah, I definitely feel like a lot of the environmental stuff shows kind of the folly of libertarian land policy, because it just ends up you get like these feudal land barons or ranchers,
it doesn't work.
or you just get like total chaos.
It doesn't really work itself out. Right?
No, it just ends up being very violent, because if you don't have a third party governmental agency overseeing things, people will take matters in their own hands very quickly.
But at the same time, it's the people that are taking the matters into their hands, not the government. Right.
In terms of like the organizations that work.
Yeah, these are.
I mean, it depends. Yeah, on when and where we're talking about. Okay. For the most part, we're talking about private groups like the Boone and Crockett Club, which Teddy Roosevelt founded, which was like a group that initially worked to save bison in the West. And they still exist today. We could become members right now if we wanted to.
Whoa. Is the fee a lot?
I've never actually looked into it. But on the other hand, you did have some actual conservation efforts as done by the government, but as I was saying, like with the Bureau of Biological Survey, most of those conservation efforts weirdly involve like for instance, the deliberate eradication of all wolves from the West. Like wolves were almost driven to extinction because of the combined efforts of private citizens, ranchers groups, and the government. Under this belief that to destroy wolves would actually preserve nature in a better state.
Well, yeah, Mao tries the same thing in the 60s. Is there ever a Mao Zedong kind of moment where, he says the four pests, the sparrows, the mosquitoes.
Well, you gotta kill them all.
Yeah, and he says kill them all, and it ends up creating a famine that kills millions.
Well, that's an example of what happens when you mess with natural.
Right, but did we have anything like that happen in America? Like
the Dust Bowl, maybe.
I mean, that's
less of like a big game animal, but more of like
certainly environmental
processes of land use.
As far as animals go, like I wouldn't say anything quite the same as that.
It was just similar.
Unless you look at it, what we already referenced, like how the deliberate extermination of bison, how that would have affected indigenous people's lives and that kind of stuff. Like, so it would have caused some famine and heartache in that respect. But I think it worked differently in America. In part because of the fact that it's a capitalist country versus a communist, maybe different time frames, different eras. And there's all kinds of these contingent kind of factors. But say you look at passenger pigeons, passenger pigeons, they darkened the skies at one point.
Yeah.
And then they were all gone. And then they just it seemed like almost overnight to people.
It's like the textbook case, isn't it?
Right. Because like mostly the idea was like there's so many of these things we could just kill and kill and kill, like the fable of abundance, right?
But what did they do? Like what did they do with passengers? Did they people ate pigeons, right?
People ate pigeons. Yeah, they ate them, but also they just killed them
for fun. Yeah.
Just for fun.
They just like toss them in the river, huh?
The belief, oh, they're blacking out the skies. There's too many of them. Like prior to, all right, so like before the Columbian Exchange, before white people really came here en masse, bison and passenger pigeon populations were held in check by indigenous people, and then viruses swept the world, or swept this half the world. And with the 90% reduction of humankind here, you had this explosion of animals like bison and like passenger pigeons. So by the time like Lewis and Clark are going out west and describing these moving seas of animals, of bison and that kind of stuff, like they're looking at this boom period that's unnatural anyways, right? Like it's already like with all these bison.
It looks too much.
It looks too, and it was too much because indigenous people ate passenger pigeons like plenty. So once those, so with them gone and no one really hunting them, the populations explode, and then people are like, well, there's just so many, kill, and then they realize they killed too many.
Wow.
And that's the end of that story.
That's like, man. And so, okay, can we become presentist now?
Sure.
Like, we're going to have to leave the groundhogs a little bit. But
it's fine.
Are we doing the same thing in any way? Like, are there still these sort of, like, I saw that terrible story a couple weeks ago about the blue whale being killed in Norway.
Is that the one that had like 80 pounds of plastic engorged in him?
Oh, no, I didn't even see that. No, because I don't click on it because it disgusts me.
Yeah, it's awful.
Are you like? What do you mean, present in terms of like
just sort of the way we interact with animals now? Because it seems like a lot of our stuff is still run by voluntary organizations.
Oh yeah.
It seems like so like especially in my bird and manatee world,
well,
it takes one rich guy to say I like manatees.
I think in a weird way, this is my spicy hot take. But I think that the difference now is that we've almost like inverted our relationship with nature, where I think you see now a much like a larger movement of like the anthropomorphization of animals,
which you can thank Disney for that.
Yeah, and like the perception of like how animals are like like how they're intelligent and how they also have emotions and thoughts and languages. And more how it seemed like, we animals are so much more like humans than we thought.
Right.
Or this idea that your personal relationship with animals can be really close and really amazing, which I think also is probably just the rise in pet ownership. Whereas I think, obviously in the past, like people just did not care about animals because they just thought like this thing has no moral status whatsoever. Whereas I feel like though the problem with that now, with this kind of ultra anthropomorphization of animals, I think as a result of because so many people are fundamentally divorced from actual wild animals and also it means that like this is why you hear all these crazy stories of like when people go to national parks or like famously Yellowstone, right? They like do crazy stuff with animals because they just don't understand that they're wild and they're not the type of thing that you imagine them to be. Like people like the famous case in Yellowstone, I think it was a couple years ago, where somebody there was like a baby bison out in the woods. And these people they thought it was lost, and so they picked it up and they put it in their car and brought it to like a park ranger because they're like, "Can you like help the baby, like the bison?" It's like no, like after that they tried to reintroduce the baby bison back to its mom, but like it already smelled like humans, and so the mom wouldn't accept it again, and so it ended up dying. And like just stuff like that, where I think, or like you hear all kinds of crazy stories of tourists like trying to like pet bears, and just stuff like that, where it's like because there are sense
we should
of
let those people pet bears.
Well, see, that's eugenics talking, Steve.
Well, you know what? As a
eugenicist,
both fan of Theodore Roosevelt and Korea, I find myself torn on this issue.
You're gonna lose a job someday over that comment.
I know.
I would argue. I would in part agree with you, and in part argue against what you just said. I strongly agree with the anthropomorphization of animals. Like we can really point at Walt Disney specifically for that. That's what I wrote my master's thesis on, actually.
Really? Okay.
Because people
started with the mouse.
Well, people think of Walt Disney and they think of the 20th century.
Bambi.
They think of Bambi and that kind of stuff. Absolutely, it's a big part of it, right? That was a huge part of it.
Mouse.
But also like remember when Little Mermaid? Well, this is a little before your time.
Little Mermaid.
So Little Mermaid came out and people were like, Disney is back because Donald Bluth and stuff was kind of owning the 80s before that. There was this big chunk of time in the 20th century when like Disney was hardly releasing cartoons. The ones they were releasing weren't really profitable. What they were releasing was nature films. A lot of nature films. Like so many nature films that I grew up in the 1980s and 90s still seeing these same nature films recorded in the 50s and 60s in my science classes. Right? Yeah, so generations of people grew up with like the same narrator, with the same folksy kind of like, hey, y'all, look at this here bear. He's a friend of God. And like, this belief, this anthropomorphization. But the reason I argue against it is because you look at things like very recently in Minnesota, Michigan, like they're starting to see places where like, hey, wolves are making a comeback. It's like, hey, all right, well, they're no longer endangered. Let's open them up for hunting then. Just immediately. Just like, all right, let's open them
right
up for
that in
hunting.
Idaho a lot too.
Yeah, Idaho's had a lot of problems with that kind of stuff. Like, pretty much there's still like, or you look at like development. Anytime there's any development stalled because of any sort of animal or anything, it's just a joke. It's just a joke. People are like, oh, we got to save that one woodpecker just to say, and it's like, and all these jobs are lost, and it's like, well, do you care about anything beyond humankind? The answer is usually no.
No. Well, not in any other action.
Well, I think a lot too. I think it's that the kind of attitude of like extinction was impossible, which then I think easily mapped over to humans making animals extinct is actually natural and what God intended.
Right,
I think a lot of that has bled over into kind of the modern crazy right-wing evangelicalism of America, and also climate change denial, or the idea that climate change isn't something to worry about because of evangelicalism. Well, sorry,
bring out the juicy bits at the end.
Just like throwing bombs over here, but like because the idea is like
40 million.
If
people.
you have an ideology of like God created the world a certain way and God has chosen humans for like to be the whatever,
which is what they did.
Yeah. And then the idea is then anything that that humans do to the environment is what God wants.
I also want
so climate change I think is like kind of the new event horizon.
But there's also the reverse, the Noel Yuval Harari, Homo Deus, where people are now saying it doesn't really matter what we've done in the past because we can bring the mastodon back.
Oh yeah.
Anywhave
you seen any of the mock-ups of what it would look like at this point?
Elon Musk is probably going to make a robot, so we're fine.
Would be
he'll make it after it matters.
I want to see what is like the Pleistocene Park. I would want to go see that. Not Jurassic Park would suck, but Pleistocene Park.
Well, we'll see. The first animal to be de-extinctioned will either be the mastodon or the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger. I think it's going to be one of those two. I'd like to see the thylacine myself. Actually, I'd like to see neither because the whole idea creeps me out.
I mean, it's a little crazy. I would love to see the aurochs come back.
I'd like to see the Neanderthal.
Okay, that's
oh wait, there he is.
All
right.
But I was gonna say real briefly the one that British explorer. Come on.
Oh yeah,
you looked it up.
I did it. So Richard Burton. That's why I was thinking of like the actor Richard Burton, but then there's Richard Burton, the explorer. Yeah, because like it's like the same process of like kind of Lewis and Clark going west and kind of people going into this new environment that's also happening roughly at the same time in Africa. And it's interesting because I wrote this paper really like going through Richard Burton's writings and trying to kind of get like, what is this guy thinking?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is someone who's educated in England from the upper classes, what is their perception when they're put in this totally different environment, but also in an environment that they've been taught is alien to them and that the people are like less than them? Mm-hmm. And what is your perception of that? Yeah. And I don't know if you found this in your own research, Travis, or even you, Steve, but like the way I argued it is I thought that like for a lot of people at this time, kind of in the Victoria era, in both America and Britain and their kind of exploration, is that they perceived wild nature and kind of native peoples as almost like they were almost like time traveling in a sense, because they would perceive that going into these environments and encountering these people, they were like going back and encountering what the ancient world was like.
Yeah, there was this belief that they're like primordial man.
Yeah, primordial man and primordial environment. So the idea would, of course, is like the
most basic state.
Yeah, we white people, we live in this advanced, progressive civilization, and we've like transcended these conditions like thousands of years ago. But when we go, say, into sub-Saharan Africa, we're encountering what the ancient world would have been like man in nature in its most primal, most early form. And the idea is that they literally thought they were in that sense stepping back into time in these environments. So it's almost like a kind of like environmental time travel and like civilizational time travel in their own minds is how they perceived what they were doing.
And that kind of gets at what I do largely, which is I never thought I'd get into intellectual history, but that's kind of what I do because I'm always trying to figure out like what people thought about nature, like this capital N nature, you know.
I've heard that before. It always goes back to intellectual history. It's why I still assign Joseph Conrad in my class. Because you get that kind of sense of what is this guy seeing and thinking.
Yeah, good.
All right, so we're down to our recommendations. It's been a fantastic hour talking about everything, really, but mostly the environment. What do you have for us this week, Mathias?
Okay, I have 2 recommendations.
No, you only get one. Save it.
No.
All right.
Do I get 2?
No.
We could go on for another 2 hours.
No, okay, I'm just okay. I've been binge watching the Mission Impossible series, which is great. That's also
Wait,
like
series, the movies,
the franchise.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Okay. Because there's a new one just came out, and it's just great because it's like mostly been different directors that do each movie, and so you can kind of see it's almost like a showcase series of like
watch them in order.
Of watching like how do different action directors, how do they do their takes? Like,
that scene where he's in the Burj Khalifa, is that MI3 or
I think I don't know. It's 3 or 4, but I know like Brian De Palma in the first one is like totally different than say John Woo in the second one. And the John Woo, what an incredibly wild human.
So your recommendation is to marathon Mission
Impossible. I mean, it's not a historical recommendation.
No, it's fine.
I'm changing my recommendation.
I've been reading this. I'm going to finish it soon. So this Russian historian by the name of George Vernadsky, he was an emigre from Russia during the Civil War. So he was like a white emigre, I guess we could term him. And he lived in Prague for a little while, and then he moved to the States and was a professor at Yale. I think he died in the 70s, but he wrote like this big like 5-volume history of Russia up until like the late 17th century. And I've been reading that, and that's been a really fun experience. I'm on like the last volume, so.
Mathias is the only person I know who marathons both Mission Impossible and 5-volume history of Russia.
You gotta like keep your feelers out, be exposed to the world.
I think it's fantastic. All right, my recommendation for this week, although I want to change them because you're going very poppy on me, you know.
Hey, there is no such thing as low and high culture. There's only culture.
Yeah, no, I'm going to use the Sinica podcast. Sinica, Sinica. It's a podcast that's on Chinese current events.
Ooh,
it's fantastic production quality. They get really great guests, and you know, like their last episode was about smoking in China and how like that's still like the world's number 2 cause of death. You know, so you just learn so much. So I highly recommend everyone listen to the Sinica podcast. That's my recommendation. Cool. Even if you're not into China, it's like, whoa, they throw out a lot of good info. Right. Travis, what do you have for us?
I'm gonna recommend a book.
Okay.
Since I was talking about Environmental History Day, I'd like to talk about a impactful book, to use Andrew Eisenberg's favorite word.
All right. By Andrew Eisenberg?
No. The book is by J.R. McNeill. It's called Mosquito Empire. It's all about the role of the mosquito in the Revolutionary era, and like, you know, most there's a lot of books about war and a lot of books about battles, and they kind of like put off like, oh, then, you know, so and so million died of dysentery or whatever. And this kind of like contextualizes that and puts that into perspective, also showing how that can be used to the advantage of people like the Haitians in their
and he even talks about the American Revolution in there too.
Right. Yeah. And then lastly, I'm going to recommend the album by Superchunk, the album What a Time to Be Alive. Check it out if you haven't already, because it's the best album of 2018.
Wow, what a pleasure to have you along, Travis. Hopefully you can come back and we can talk about pop culture, because I when Disney came up, I saw there's a twitch in him. I could go on for days about it.
I'd love to come back. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. And as always, Mathias, thank you. And you're welcome for me being here. This is Hour of History. And
thanks for gracing us with your presence.
Our world, any place, anytime.